Okay, welcome back to this afternoon session, which I have the pleasure to chair. And our first speaker, whom I will introduce now, is Amanda Holmes. And she's a faculty member at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna. And she received her PhD in philosophy from Villanova University in 2020. And her first book, Naming the Real, Formations of Lacan's Objet A, is under contract with State University of New York Press. And now I'm trying to figure out, and her title, now I found it a bit late. The title of her talk today is Lacan's Repetition, Object, Lack under the Sign of Kierkegaard. And please join me in welcoming Amanda Holmes. And
Thank you. Thanks, Jan, and thank you so much, Jelica, for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here. Okay, I'll just jump right in. It will be some time before we get to the Kierkegaard, so. Of the many questions that will eventually lead Lacan to his invention of the objet A, we begin with the one that is formulated in the fourth year of his seminar, the year that Lacan took as his theme the object relation. The central and guiding question of that year, from 1956 to 1957, the question posed at the beginning of the seminar, and the question that served as the seminar's endpoint, is simply this: is the object real or not? Now, before delving into what Lacan might have meant by real in this instance, and offering caveats regarding the periodization of the Lacanian real, we can situate this question at face value as one aimed at the notion of reality operative within the reality principle in post-Freudian psychoanalysis, specifically within object relations theory. This is, after all, the context in which Lacan offers this particular seminar by taking up the theme of the object relation. Lacan's choice of topic in this fourth year makes an important and telling departure from his earlier three seminars, which had focused primarily on interpreting Freudian texts and establishing the primacy of the signifier within the Freudian practice. With his turn to the object relation, Lacan confronts in a more direct way his contemporaries. In particular, he addresses with some derision a collective of Melanie Klein's followers in France, led by the psychoanalysts Maurice Bouvet and Sacha Nacht, who had composed a two-volume treatise entitled La Psychanalyse d'aujourd'hui. This text serves Lacan well for several years in this period as an example of what he calls the boundless stupidity of his colleagues, a stupidity which, he claims, paraphrasing Renan, gives an idea of the infinite. In this volume, which Lacan references repeatedly in the seminar and also in the direction of the treatment and the principles of its power, we find accounts of the object relation that are indeed most antithetical to Lacan's own reading of Freud. For example, in the lead article by Bouvet, he lays out the object relation at each of the three stages in Freudian development, moving from the oral and the anal stage, which are both characterized by what he calls an archaic relation to reality and to the object. The object relation eventually culminates, according to Bouvet, with the genital object, which corresponds to a non-archaic relation to reality, characterized by a decrease in magical thinking and symbolic displacement. This theoretical model translates into a clinical setting in which the notion of the genital object coincides with the goal of analytic experience, an experience that enables the analysand to eventually reach an ideal object, an object that is described as terminal, perfect, and adequate. It is, in short, the promise of an object of desire finally fulfilled. Most egregiously, Bouvet's account of psychoanalysis is that the practice aims at the normalization of the subject. But what Lacan harps on most throughout the seminar, what seems to be the most objectionable claim in this volume, is that there is what he calls a harmonious object that characterizes the sexual relationship. That the relation between the sexes, if both parties have achieved their genital object, can get along in harmony. Such an idea, Lacan says, is at absolute variance with analytic experience, And he elaborates, I won't even say analytic experience, but the common experience of relations between man and woman. If harmony in this realm were not a problematic thing, there would be no psychoanalysis at all. Psychoanalysis is precisely the practice of dealing with the dissonance and disharmony of the subject's relations, both at the order of sexual relations and at the order of those with the object. The object relations theory that one finds in this volume, represented by Bouvet and Nacht, however, is not representative of the whole of object relations theory. Lacan goes on to discuss the object relation in other contexts, and it is with significantly more respect and camaraderie that Lacan addresses the thought of Melanie Klein and Donald Winnicott, noting in particular the advances made with the latter's development of the transitional object. We might say that Lacan repeats his signature move here, just as he reads Freud against the Freudians, he reads Klein against the Kleinians, and addresses Winnicott, albeit briefly, in his own right. Lacan, in fact, defends Klein against a criticism developed by two authors who are part of this volume that's headed by Bouvet and Nacht. Lacan's defense of Klein is of interest here because in it he addresses the core problem that the objet A, defined as eventually as the object cause of desire, will name. It is, at this stage, a concern with how psychoanalysis thinks the psychical causality of the subject, cast in terms of the reality of the object. In an article by Francis Pache and Michel Reynard, the question of the reality of the object is addressed through two principles of psychoanalytic theory. The authors are concerned primarily with how one can anchor the psychoanalytic notion of reality, of how to guarantee the real external object and the subject's relation to it. The problem is that there are two seemingly incompatible principles of Freud's thought. On the one hand, they say, Freud postulates that we retain the memory of a primeval event and image, for example, in the text on Moses and monotheism. Impressions from the outside are said to be passed down through generations and are given a hereditary origin. There is something like a phylogenetic memory operative in some aspects of Freud's thinking. This comes to determine how we conceive of the object relation. And on the other hand, there are, in the theory of the drives, certain mechanistic convictions that explain, for example, how an object gets cathected in the first place. The authors of this article associate Kleinian theory with the first of these tendencies and hold that Kleinian theory risks the attribution of everything to the subject from the outset. They assert that Klein places the whole of the Oedipus complex and its development as pre-given at the level of instincts. Lacan comments, "It is quite striking to read them reproaching Melanie Klein for a developmental theory that, according to these authors and their criticisms, would place everything within the subject in a preformed fashion. In the way the authors frame the comparison, which is how it is for some in the biological theory of development, the full-grown oak would already be wholly present in the acorn. Nothing would come to the subject from the outside." Without naming it explicitly, the authors end up accusing Klein of an Aristotelian thinking that privileges formal and final causality. The reference to the full-grown oak already present in the acorn evokes an Aristotelian metaphysics of potentiality. Meanwhile, the authors themselves unwittingly reproduced the Platonic doctrine of anamnesis in their own attempts to reconcile phylogenetic memories with the theory of the drives. They write, now this is the article that's criticizing Klein, in the conclusion, they say, "The child is born with certain inherited instinctual drives into a world which he does not yet perceive, but which he recalls, and which later he will not have to create simply from within himself and from nothing else, but a series of chance discoveries, but a world he will come to recognize. The authors thus reproduce the Platonic doctrine of recollection as they criticize Klein's supposed Aristotelianism. This criticism, Lacan shows, is not only unfounded and untenable, but it misses the most important insights in Klein's work, all while sneaking a Platonic metaphysics into psychoanalytic theory. If there is indeed one thing that Klein gives us an idea of, Lacan says, it is surely that the first situation is far more chaotic. At the start, it is truly anarchic. What characterizes the origin is the noise and fury of the drives. The question, therefore, is much rather how something like an order can be established on this basis. In order to appreciate Lacan's defense of Klein here, we might have to set aside some of Lacan's own criticisms of her work in the earlier seminars, when he was concerned with distancing his own emphasis on the symbolic order from Klein's understanding of symbol formation. Lacan insisted in the earlier seminars that Klein was entirely caught up in the realm of the imaginary, and because of this, she misunderstood the analytic relation. An element of this criticism remains here, but when Lacan is addressing the question regarding the reality of the object, Klein's thinking serves as a buttress for his own development of the real. Klein's thinking is shown to be in a much greater proximity to Lacan's own, at least comparatively in this instance. Consider Klein's emphasis on symbolism in her 1930 essay on the topic, where she writes, "Not only does symbolism come to be the foundation of all fantasy and sublimation, but, more than that, upon it is built the subject's relation to the outside world and to reality in general." While this is by no means a strong forerunner of the Lacanian symbolic order, Klein's own position does at least pose the question of the genesis of the subject in the register that Lacan's own thinking echoes. That is to say, it is a question of how something like an order gets established on the basis of the sound and fury of the drives. And it is worth reflecting on what is at stake in this movement, from the theme of the third year of Lacan's seminar on psychosis to that of the object relation in the fourth year. Rather than taking for granted that each year of the seminar is guided by a different topic, we might situate this transition from psychosis to the object relation as instructive for thinking the primary insight that is in fact shared between both Klein and Lacan, that a full appreciation of the radicality of Freud's discovery depends upon a reading of how it is that the subject's relation to reality is mediated by the strange world of fantasy. Although, of course, in Klein, this is fantasy with a PH, and in Lacan, it's not. For Klein, fantasy is the dominating feature of the child's early reality. She writes, "The child's early reality is wholly fantastic. He is surrounded with objects of anxiety, and in this respect, excrement, organs, objects, things animate and inanimate, are to begin with equivalent to one another. As the ego develops, a true relation to reality is gradually established out of this unreal reality." For both Klein and Lacan, it is precisely the domain of the unreal reality that we find not only in early childhood, but also in psychosis. In psychosis, as Lacan discusses it in the third year of his seminar, reality itself initially contains a hole that the world of fantasy will subsequently fill. Psychosis is distinguished from neurosis inasmuch as, in the latter, in neurosis, reality is not fully rearticulated symbolically into the external world. It is marked by a partial flight from reality, an incapacity to confront this secretly preserved part of reality, a part of reality that is secretly preserved insofar as it is repressed. Lacan's description here follows very closely that given by Freud in his essay on two principles of mental functioning. There, Freud addresses the problem of reality through an explicit nosology. He writes, "The neurotic turns away from reality because he finds it unbearable, either the whole or in parts." And the most extreme type of this alienation from reality is shown in certain cases of hallucinatory psychosis. Lacan develops Freud's line of thinking by making the distinction between neurosis and psychosis consist not only in a matter of degree, as Freud does here, but in the different mechanism of alienation at play. While a neurotic structure depends upon the repression of some troubling part of reality, in psychosis, reality itself presents an absence insofar as what is rejected cannot even be recognized as repressed. According to the thesis Lacan pursues throughout Seminar 3, the fundamental difference between neurosis and psychosis hinges upon the distinction between Verwerfung, what Lacan translates into Verklusion or foreclosure, and Verdrängung or repression. Drawing on Freud's case study of the Wolfman, Lacan explains that the psychotic structure of foreclosure entails that the patient does not want to know anything about it, not even in the sense of repression. Lacan points out that Freud says something similar in his essay on fetishism. There, he addresses an ambiguity in how Freud conceives of the role of repression in psychosis, but ultimately he says it's to a deficiency, to a hole in the symbolic that Freud is referring. The structure of Verwerfung, what characterizes psychosis, is a not wanting to know anything about it, in the strongest sense. It is the equivalent to a hole in reality. This is a hole that can be filled only by fantasy. In short, fantasy is what patches over a hole in reality in the formulation of psychosis, as Lacan develops it in the third year of his seminar. For Klein, the schizoid use of fantasy operates in relation not to a hole in reality, but to the act of splitting reality. Fantasy is structured in relation to the body of the mother, which is the first constitutive object. Here's a quote from Klein. I have often expressed my view that object relations exist from the beginning of life, the first object being the mother's breast, which to the child becomes split into the good, gratifying, and bad, frustrating breast. This splitting results in the severance of love and hate. Klein writes, the infant projects his love impulses and attributes them to the gratifying good breast, just as he projects his destructive impulses outwards and attributes them to the frustrating bad breast. Here we can identify the origin of the object's paradox as implied by Klein. The object comes into being only insofar as it organizes the impulses that come from the infant. The breast becomes an object for the infant insofar as it receives that which the infant projects onto it. Love and destruction, gratification and frustration, good and bad. As objects, the good breast and the bad breast originate not in the object itself, but in the infant's relation to it. That is to say, they originate in fantasy. Simultaneously, in Kleinian theory, by introjection, a good breast and a bad breast are established inside. Thus, the picture of the object, external and internalized, is distorted in the infant's mind by his fantasies, which are bound up with the projection of his impulses onto the object. One of Klein's insights regarding the early infantile relation to the object here is that fantasy is imposed upon the object and plays an important role in its genesis. It is the fantasy that is formulated on the basis of introjection and projection in relation to gratification and frustration that splits the object into two. But it is the original multiplicity of the infant's own impulses that made this act of splitting possible. Thus, the infant establishes a relation to reality through a mediating fantasy which distorts it. And yet, it is this very distortion that makes possible the maturation of the infant into a subject. It leads to what Klein calls the synthesizing of the ego in relation to the object. So where fantasy splits one breast into two, it also synthesizes the fractured ego into one. Building on the Kleinian model, Winnicott casts what he calls the transitional objects and transitional phenomena as a way of articulating the shifting space between external and internal reality, between the pleasure principle and the reality principle. His interest, he says, lies there in the space between. Winnicott writes about the phenomena that can be addressed neither in terms of an internal reality nor external reality. As he describes it, there is a third part of the life of a human being, a part that we cannot ignore, an intermediate area of experiencing in which inner reality and external life both contribute. It is an area which is not challenged because no claim is made on its behalf, except that it shall exist as a resting place for the individual engaged in the perpetual human task of keeping inner and outer reality separate yet interrelated. With the concepts of the transitional object and transitional phenomena, Winnicott thinks the substance of illusory experience, which he associates with art, religion, and interestingly, the fetish. The transitional object is neither a hallucination, nor is it firmly on the side of reality as such. It lies somewhere in between. By clutching some corner of a blanket or the floppy ear of a stuffed bunny, the child finds her first substitute for the breast, but more importantly, begins to hold onto a little piece of the real. The transitional object is not simply a substitute. It also has to seem to the infant to have a particular vitality or reality of its own. For Winnicott, the point of the transitional object is not its symbolic value, so much as its actuality. Its not being the breast or the mother, although real, is as important as the fact that it stands for the breast or the mother. There is a certain gap here introduced by Winnicott between the account of how the infant comes to symbolization through substitution. It gets close to what Lacan will name with his notion of object lack. Lacan situates Winnicott's transitional object squarely within his own vocabulary of the imaginary, but acknowledges that Winnicott has at least identified what it is that is absolutely primordial. So Winnicott has at least identified what is absolutely primordial and decisive in the infant's apprehension of reality. That is, as we start replacing the impersonal and dialectical opposition between the reality principle and the pleasure principle with something to which we have given actors, subjects, the pleasure principle starts to be identified with a particular relation to an object, namely the maternal breast, and the reality principle, meanwhile, starts to be identified with the fact that the child has to learn to go without it. But what is forgotten in the dialectic that is laid out in Winnicott's account of the transitional object is, Lacan says, one of the most essential mainsprings of the entire analytic experience, namely the notion of object lack. We can never do without a notion of the lack of object as a central matter in our concrete practice of analytic theory. The missing object is not a negative, but the very mainspring of the subject's relationship with the world. Lacan interjects here a kind of object that is prior even to Winnicott's transitional object. It is an object that Winnicott himself comes very close to naming in his insistence that the transitional object's not being the breast is as important as its standing for the breast. That is to say, it's not yet the transitional object qua little graspable piece of the real that Lacan identifies as the mainspring of the subject's relationship to the world. It is quite simply the lack of object that renders this relationship to the world possible. It is worth noting, moreover, that Lacan does not say relationship to reality, but relationship to the world. The relationship to reality, as we know, will be more complicated and will require some important twists in the thinking of the real. So now that we've addressed some of the context of Lacan's seminar on the object relation, let us return to our guiding question that Lacan poses repeatedly. Is the object real or not? The concepts of the object and the real go hand in psychoanalysis as far back as Freud's own formulations in which reality is tested according to whether or not one can re-find the cathected object, and the object is itself cathected insofar as it at least once brought quote-unquote real satisfaction, die einst reale Befriedigung gebracht hatten. That is, whatever we mean by the object in psychoanalysis is, from the very beginning, something that corresponds to the question of reality and the subject's relation to it. The object always implies an attempt to whittle down the whole of reality to its minimal unit, to think what is out there as what can be grasped, clutched, and above all, refound, thereby both initiating and guaranteeing the tenuous and fragile distinction between psychical and objective reality. Likewise, any invocation of the real, or reality in psychoanalysis, is bound to depend upon the object for some kind of measure. As Lacan acknowledges, the object is being implicitly spoken of whenever the notion of reality comes into play. When Lacan responds to the object relation by insisting on the primacy of object lack, he is also responding to an essential dilemma to be found in the corresponding notion of reality. Lacan is clear that when he poses this question, is the object real or not, he is not naming the object of philosophy. It is neither the Ding an sich of Kantian critique, nor is it the Gegenstand of phenomenology. Lacan says, I am underscoring the distance that lies between, on the one hand, the subject's relationship to the object in Freud's work, and on the other, what preceded it in a certain conception of the object as a corresponding object, the object expected in advance, coapted to the subject's maturation. This full distance is already implicit in what contrasts a Platonic perspective, the perspective that grounds each apprehending, each recognition upon the reminiscence of a type that is in some sort preformed, with a profoundly different notion. It is the same distance that lies between modern experience and the experience in antiquity, and it is set out by Kierkegaard in the register of repetition. The repetition that is forever sought out, but essentially never satisfied, in so much that of its very nature, it is not reminiscence by any stretch of the imagination. It is in this register that Freud's notion of refinding the lost object is located. So we've already seen the implicit Platonic metaphysics at work in the debates around phylogenetic memory within object relations theory. The extent to which the work of Klein and Winnicott are equally implicated in this hidden metaphysics remains unclear. But Lacan here signals a departure that his own reading of Freud makes from the Platonic model, and it lies in the difference between Platonic recollection, anamnesis, and Kierkegaard's repetition. Aligning object relations theory with the Platonic theory of forms, we can begin to see just what is at stake when Lacan sets his own teaching in contrast under the sign of Kierkegaard. Where Platonic repetition entails a model of knowing and learning based on remembering and reminiscence, which is secured by the existence of the forms, for Kierkegaard, repetition always involves a little torque. It entails something of the impossible. Most clearly, this impossibility is inscribed in Kierkegaard's repetition, when the narrator, Constantine Constantius, attempts to repeat a trip to Berlin and is thwarted at every turn. He wants to see if it is possible to repeat a trip from his past, staying in the same house, going to the same theaters, frequenting the same coffee houses in Berlin. But he is never able to repeat his past experience. Much to his chagrin, Constantius has to admit, I had discovered that there was no such thing as repetition, and I became aware of this by having it repeated in every possible way. Repetition thus becomes the punchline of a joke about its own impossibility. Repetition exists, but only in the repetition of the futility of its existence. By registering the refound object under the sign of Kierkegaard, Lacan specifies the peculiar character of object lack and the Freudian refound object. The refound object is not limited to the object from Freud's discussions of reality testing, but is everywhere in Freud's texts. It is inscribed within the theory of the drive. Lacan says, when he is laying out the theory of instinctual development, such as it can be isolated in the first analytic experiences, Freud indicates that it is grasped along the path of a search for the lost object. This object that corresponds to an advanced stage in the maturation of instincts is the object of the first weaning, found again. It is the object that was initially the point of attachment to the infant's earliest satisfactions. It is a refound object. There is an obvious difficulty in thinking the notion of the refound object along with Lacan. On the one hand, it has to bring, first, real satisfaction, reale Befriedigung, on Freud's account, and on the other, Lacan insists that it is object lack that is the mainspring of the subject's relation to the world. It is the lack and not the object that comes first. So we find ourselves in a more sophisticated version of the chicken or the egg. How can object lack come first? It is with the help of Kierkegaard's logic of repetition, a repetition which is predicated on its own impossibility, that we can see a way to respond to this dilemma. It is the difference between the object of object relations theory and the object lack of the Lacanian teaching, which repeats the difference between the ancient and the modern, Plato and Kierkegaard. Several years earlier, in the second year of his seminar, Lacan relied on a similar distinction to describe how Freud structured human experience. And interestingly there, the ancient account is characterized by harmony. Freud distinguishes two completely different structurations of human experience, one which, along with Kierkegaard, he calls ancient, based on reminiscence, presupposing agreement, harmony between man and the world of his objects, which means that he recognizes them because in some way he has always known them. And on the contrary, the conquest, the structuration of the world through the effort of labor, along the path of repetition, to the extent that what appears to him corresponds only partially with what has already gained him satisfaction. The subject engages in a quest and repeats his quest indefinitely until he rediscovers his object. The Platonic forms pave the way to conceiving of the harmonious relation described in object relations theory. And if we are to follow Lacan's line, this is precisely where it stumbles. Kierkegaard himself addresses the difference between the ancient and the modern accounts of repetition in the opening lines of Repetition. Again, we hear from Constantine Constantius, repetition is a crucial expression for what recollection was to the Greeks. Just as they taught that all knowing is a recollecting, modern philosophy will teach that all life is a repetition. The only modern philosopher who has had an intimation of this is Leibniz. Repetition and recollection are the same movement, except in opposite directions. For what is recollected has been, is repeated backwards, whereas genuine repetition is recollected forward. Repetition, therefore, if it is possible, makes a person happy, whereas recollection makes him unhappy. Assuming, of course, that he gives himself time to live and does not promptly at birth find an excuse to sneak out of life again. For example, the excuse that he has forgotten something. Again, we find the exemplary moment of an impossibility inscribed at the heart of repetition. The strange motion of recollecting forward, a repetition which is an encounter with the new. And again, in the form of something that at least sounds like a joke, the only way out of the unhappy reminiscence is possibly to have forgotten something. Isn't this, after all, another possible definition of the unconscious? That it is the recollection of those things we forget. Chief among them is whether the object is real or not.
Thank you very much, Amanda. We have time for questions. Anybody? No. So I'm glad to begin. I have one short. It's not really a question. It's a remark which kept me thinking throughout your paper, because you have a sort of interweaving between different notions of beginning. Yeah. Like I counted like almost 4 or 5. So there's early childhood. There's the beginning of the let's say construction of the real. There is the question of the ancient and the moderns. And then there is the question of the primacy of object lack. And then, of course, there's also the question of the repetition, which is, I think, also somehow linked to the question of the beginning. And I kept wondering, how, this is, of course, it's not coincidence, but maybe you could just explain or say a little word about especially the relation, or how you would conceive of the relation between the subject of early childhood on the one hand and the question of the real or the reality real link. Maybe you could say a word on this, because so you see, it's not really a question, it's just a remark that kept me.
Yeah, no, I think that it's the subject of early childhood is in many ways not, obviously it's not Lacan's question. In a way, this is why what's difficult about trying to sort of dramatize his response to object relations theory is that on the one hand, I'm aiming to give a kind of account of where maybe there's more ambiguity than Lacan lets on in how his own theories were shaped by this relation in particular to Melanie Klein. And I think what's difficult is in the sort of attempt to name those points, I myself get a bit sort of led down the path of how Klein wants to narrate it. And so, I mean, I guess on the one hand, for Lacan, this is why he's always very clear to say, object relations theory in many ways sort of is limited to the sort of domain of describing the imaginary experience. So the account of origin that we get is this sort of like little narrative, so that makes sense. But I think that there's maybe something else there that is at play in how it is that he's reading Klein, which is that there's also, in his mind, a problem that he sees which will compel him to have to describe the real in a different way. And so it's funny that you say this, because this paper, I think I've rewritten it and tried to reformulate it a number of times because I can't quite figure out the right starting point. I'm trying to give this context because I feel like the starting point to describe the objet A is like usually way later when it gets named. But I think that there's something about the problem I'm trying to describe here that at least sets the stage of how that is the case. So, there's this kind of fascination with the real, with the beginning, and how it's, trying to. I guess what I'm interested in trying to describe is how it is that this problem of reality is also the point at which Lacan has to really stake his claims regarding the sort of metaphysical presuppositions of object relations theory. So it's some associations on the way.
Questions? Helmut? I think you get a microphone.
Many thanks, Amanda. Is this working? Yeah? Okay. I should have read your paper before I wrote mine. So we will come back to some of our questions. But maybe, I would like just to ask you, I think Jan's question is an important one, and the other one referring to the topic of this conference, how you would situate, this question of a border or the boundary in there, and I think this is crucially, interesting in a certain way, in precisely in defining the object lack or the object relation, the question of reality or existence of object. And I would like to, because in this whole distinctions, for example, yes, Kleinians are on the imaginary side, but the depressive position is not really imaginary. It's also, it has its own distinction between what is purely imaginary and what is not, in a different language. So there are, very clear distinctions here. And that would be very interesting for me, because where are the, the borderlines in a certain way, and how are they conceived, and is the object, the border, the boundary? I mean, you said it's not the philosophical, it's not the epistemic object, clearly, would have a very clear relationship to the subject, and insofar a very clear boundary. But what is the psychoanalytic object then, in terms of that kind of, relationality within itself?
Yeah. Well, I think maybe the overall argument that I'm hoping to develop is that it's in Lacan's relationship to philosophy that he's able to respond to other psychoanalysts and to sort of identify this implicit metaphysics that's coming in. And so the question of borders there is very, it shows up insofar as, whether or not Lacan wants to think of himself as an anti-philosopher, all of these kinds of questions, whether or not he's doing philosophy. There's at least a relationship to philosophy which enables a different kind of response to this question of how it is that the object is co-constitutive of the subject, or how it is that the object comes to being for the subject. So I would say that that's one place that it's interesting to really think about whether or not there is this strong border between doing philosophy and doing psychoanalysis, at least within the context of this seminar. The second way of thinking about the border that shows up throughout the paper is obviously this border between psychical reality or internal reality and objective reality, whatever model we want to conceive that on. And I think it's probably Winnicott who, in an interesting way, is somehow as close to Lacan as he'll admit any object relations theorist as being, that precisely with this notion of the transitional object, he at least names that there's something that's not just about the exchangeability of one for another, which is the kind of Kleinian model of symbolization, that there's something about the transitional object that starts to kind of go in the direction of a negativity, because its key characteristic is it's being not the breast, not the mother. So I think that it's that negativity that Winnicott kind of opens onto that maybe allows us to think about the debates that are happening here as maybe more nuanced than at least what I've come across when I've looked at explanations of Lacan's reading of object relations theory. And there were a number of good...
Thank you very much for your lecture. It was very important, and it was also very useful for my proposition later, so thank you very much. We'll come back. But if I could understand, the reality is not the quality of the real. It's exactly the contrary, if I may say so.
Yeah.
And of course, you explained that clearly, but can you still emphasize the difference, the big difference of the opposition between the reality and the real, because we are used to think that it is quite the same, it is quite just the opposite.
Yeah.
And maybe in this sense that the reality is more in the sense of the transcendental reality by Kant. And it is just the real, it is just the antithesis of the transcendental realism, and so it is, I think, the first step to go inside a proper psychoanalysis. Can you, Ms. Keen, a little bit emphasize this kind of things?
Yes, no, thank you for the question. And this paper definitely leads to a more elaborate working out of what the real is in this fourth year of the seminar for Lacan. There are moments where he flirts with a kind of ambivalence, and it's interesting because it comes up through a Freudian notion of Wirkung as a kind of reality as Wirklichkeit. The example that Lacan gives here at this point is that there's, he talks about this hydroelectric power plant on the Rhine, and he describes how we might be tempted to think of the real as something like mana, as the kind of force that's already there in the river. But it's only until you have the existence of the hydroelectric power plant, which is a kind of metaphor, I think, for the symbolic order here, that something like the real can come to be. So I think you're absolutely right to sort of insist that the way that I'm talking about reality here is by no means the real that Lacan is developing, but I think that there's a kind of problem that he sees in the way things get talked about within object relations theory, that the real as a concept, which one way of formulating it at this point would be to say that the real is some combination of Freudian psychical reality and Bataille's notion of like heterology, that there's something about the remainder, there's something about the excess, which is not at all the problematic that we're describing here. But it also takes some time to get to that point from these debates. In other words, I think that there's something important about, well, maybe beginning how it is that we explain what the problem of the real is by showing all of the confusions and messiness and complications that come within the psychoanalytic theory that Lacan is responding to in the way that reality gets used there. So my hope is that this is, in a way, the kind of first step to show that there's at least a problem with how reality gets used and how we read the reality principle in Freud that is not reducible to, but at least sets the stage for thinking why Lacan insists upon the real. In other words, sometimes I get frustrated with a kind of Lacanian theory that kind of presupposes we just have to understand everything in terms of the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real, but without really showing the necessity of why those three categories are operative and necessary in the first place. And Lacan says here at one point, when he's trying to lay out his response to object relations theory, he says, well, in absence of this distinction between the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real, you can only talk about the real, which of course isn't the Lacanian real, but it's the way that the real gets used within object relations theory. So I think that it's a real problem that maybe I need to do a better job of showing that I'm not yet talking about the Lacanian real, but I'm trying to show why it's necessary to formulate it as he does. Yeah.
And you point out the lack in the repetition of Kierkegaard.
Yes.
And I think it's very important because when you speak about Wirklichkeit and Realität by Freud, Lacan said in a seminar later, in the seminar 17th, that they are quite different and that the Realität would be the real, but it is quite wrong, I think. So the importance of the lack in the repetition by Heidegger is much, much more accurate to point out that there is a real difference between the real and reality. And that is the most important thing outside the words by Freud and who is, I think Freud is much in the reality, or always not in the real, even if we would have to cope with the real in this point.
So we have one more question by Jelitsa.
Thank you very much for your, as always, very interesting presentation of especially Lacan's earlier seminars that are not read so attentively nowadays, which is a pity. My question relates partly to what Christian asked you. And I would like to, if you can, it's not probably a fair question, develop or indicate at least, what of Lacan's theory of object relation remains in his later elaboration of the concept of the object A. This is the first remark. And the second, how important is the shift in Lacan's later theory from neurosis towards psychosis as a general structure? So,
That's great, so what remains of Lacan's theory of Lacan's response to the object relation in the objet A? I mean, this is really the question. And I think so if we just, to try to put it, just to, for myself, clarify, if Lacan's response to the object relation is, in a way, the focus is on the object where it really ought to be on object lack, then I think the argument that I would like to make, I'm not sure if I have yet, but is that object lack is the first iteration of the objet petit a. It's an iteration that fails, but I'm trying to show how it fails. And I think it fails in a certain sense because he hasn't yet come to the full formation of the real that the later seminars will allow him to. But at this point, he's still trying to intervene within these debates among his contemporaries. And so it's maybe a bit overly cheeky or something, but to refer back to Jan's question, that it's really at the beginning. It's the beginning of the objet A that we find in the notion of object lack. And if we don't start from there, then I feel like it's really hard to get like a full picture of what the objet A becomes later. And right now, this is more of an intuition than anything else, but there is something so important about the fact that later it becomes the object cause of desire. And here the whole problem is trying to discuss psychical causality with object relations theorists. So I don't know, I mean, there's also the important fact that For Melanie Klein, it's paranoid anxiety that is there in the face of what Lacan will call object lack. And so by the time he comes to the anxiety seminar and he has a real definition of the objet petit a as being the object cause of desire, there's this kind of long setup for that as a punchline or a response. And I'm not at the point where I can hold that in my head and at the same time respond to how it is that the psychosis, neurosis thing comes back later, but I'm sure I need to maybe write that down and think about it more.
Okay, so if that is it, then we close the session, and I thank you, Amanda, for your talk and for the discussion.
Thank you for the questions. Thanks.